Sawa.
I guess I should start by saying good afternoon to everyone. And I would like to welcome you to our session on the Driving Systems Change in Africa program today by APF. And our session is titled The Gender Equality, Women's Empowerment and Climate Change. As we're all aware, climate change affects everyone, and the hardest hit being the most vulnerable on the continent, typically women and children. And in many circumstances, these vulnerable women have more effects of the climate change as compared with the male gender. And that's primarily because they're highly dependent on the local natural resources for their livelihood. In addition to this, we're aware that women grow 70% of the food in Africa, and they make up about 43% of the agricultural labor force in many of the developing countries. So my esteemed panel today, made up of many experts in their various fields, will spend the next half hour discussing the impact of climate change on girls and women and the role of stakeholders, including philanthropists, in creating a level playing ground for women to become empowered and to thrive in this space. With me today, we have Ms. Wanjira Mathai, who is the Vice President and the Regional Director for Africa at World Resource Institute. She formerly served as co-chair of WRI's Global Restoration Council and is a senior advisor to the Global Restoration Initiative. She is the current chair of the Wangari Maathai Foundation and the former chair of the Green Belt Movement in Kenya. Wanjira has over 20 years experience advocating for social and environmental change on both local and international platforms. She served on the board of the World Agroforestry Center, as well as an advisory council member on the Global Alliance for Clean Cook Stoves. She's also one of a few 6 seconds EQ practitioners in Kenya and was named one of the 100 most influential African women in 2018 and 2020. We also have with us today Dr. English Sao, who is a data enthusiast and a researcher at heart. She holds a master's degree and is currently pursuing her PhD in industrial organizational psychology at North Carolina State University. English specializes in humanitarian work and psychology, and she's also interested in how IOP, which is the industrial organization psychology, can be applied to cross-cultural leadership and workforce development within informal economies. English is also a board member of the Sal Family Foundation and is pursuing the role of a next-gen philanthropist. In addition, she's on other boards like the CARE USA, the Ed Fund, and Aspen Management Partnership for Health. My last speaker is Patrick Worms, who originally educated as a molecular geneticist and represents the world's premier research institute devoted to the study of the roles of trees in agricultural landscapes to policymakers in Brussels and elsewhere in Europe. Patrick is also the president of EURAF, the European Agroforestry excuse me, Federation. He's also a trustee and a treasurer of the International Union of Agroforestry and is a member of the steering committee of International Land Lives Peace, which works at the interface between land degradation and conflicts. I would like to welcome all three esteemed panelists to our session this afternoon. So without further ado, I think we should begin. So I'm going to start by asking my first question to English. And English and I spent some time talking yesterday about climate change and the impact that it had on women. And we discussed the foreseen as well as the identified needs of women and girls, English, if you recall, during these disasters like flooding, for instance, as well as other issues that surround climate change. Mind starting us off by just highlighting some of these disasters and these issues, perhaps those that are peculiar to the African continent as compared to the rest of the world?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dr. Anita. Really excited to be here and be part of this conversation today. I think that, as you stated, in the event of a disaster, the risk of death, the risk of injustice, the risk of injury and difficulty is just higher among women and children, really throughout the world, but also specifically in populations, marginalized populations and hard to reach populations. I think the other thing that, is important when we think about the idea of disaster, right? That has been kind of, I think, inhibiting in how we approach the effects of disaster is that we often believe that it is time bound. We often look at the word disaster or internalize it in our mind as something that there's a start and an end point. There's a moment of crisis and then it ends. And I think that there needs to be a reframe, especially as we're thinking about, the African continent and the specific things that apply when we're talking about the effect of, climate change, for example. It's not just a one-time event. It's a starting point for a longer road of difficulty and injustice in a lot of places and in a lot of ways. I think that even specifically, we look at something like the problem of hunger and malnutrition, and it's really not about whether or not the world produces enough food. It's a result of these social norms and these injustices that don't value women, and market systems that do not reach marginalized populations. Climate change in particular threatens productivity, and policies, often fail for the poorest and the most at-risk people. And these issues specifically are heightened in that moment of disaster, but often last a lifetime for people. And the other thing that I will also say, though, is that women, they're the ones at the front line when it comes to combating climate change, demanding justice, and adapting to these effects of disasters and the consequences that they leave. So I think that it's important to consider in the grand scope, what does a disaster heighten and bring to the table? But what are some of the very long-term consequences that we need to consider and think about, in particular, when it comes to the most marginalized and most affected populations?
No, thank you very much. As you rightly pointed out, that's what we need to start looking at closely. And that is a perfect way to turn to Patrick actually, and to ask my next question, my follow-up question, and which is with regards to the gender-sensitive responses that are available to address these issues of climate change, especially as we look through the lens of advancement of women, because as English rightly pointed out, they are the more vulnerable group when it comes to these issues.
Absolutely, Anita. And I'd like to pick up on what English was saying, which is to remind us that disasters today are not necessarily these time bound events that we used to associate with the words, but are much longer playing things that can operate on timescales of years to decades. And climate change is a classic example of that. It takes so long to become noticeable that by the time it becomes noticeable, you cannot stop it any longer. And that is when an extremely long term disaster begins to hit. When you talked about what I was doing, a lot of what I do has to do with making landscapes more resilient to shocks, to external shocks, be they extreme weather events brought by climate change, or be they disease, be they droughts, or even be they overexploitation by people whose customary ways of managing landscapes have broken down and whose replacement ways of managing landscapes, usually promoted by outsiders, do not quite deliver what they were hoping to deliver. And the reason we do that is because the evidence is now absolutely obvious. Unless you restore landscapes and allow these landscapes, for example, to recharge the groundwater when the rains come so the water doesn't just flow off into the rivers, allows these landscapes to increase their productivity so there's more wood fuel and women don't have to walk so far into the bush to get wood at the risk of attack or worse. As long as we don't start putting soil at the very bottom of our concerns, we are not going to be able to deal with all of the other issues that are dear to our hearts, because those are often a consequence of extremely degraded landscapes. And that's what brings me to women. The fundamental problem that we have in way too many landscapes is that women, who usually are the people who have to keep more balls in the air, juggle more balls, are being prevented from effectively implement their knowledge by the gender relationships in which they find themselves. Men very often are focused on single metrics, such as making enough money by growing a crop and selling it. Women, even if they are attracted, they are human beings, even if they are as attracted by money as men are, will also tend to think in terms of their families, will tend to think in terms of the education of their children, will tend to think of putting some money aside for a rainy day, etc., etc. So they are naturally more able to deal with multiple variables. And that is an extremely useful trait to bring to the table if you are trying to deal with the consequences of the extreme weather that climate change brings. Because one of the ways in which you can protect yourself against climate change's worst effects is by diversifying your agricultural activities, the way you use land, is by adding trees to your crop fields, is by integrated animals, livestock at any scale, is by diversifying away from the key commodities that men are interested in that you can sell and that expose you to market risks, to commodities that may have a more local market, but that increase the quality of the nutrition of your children and of your community. So because women have this ability to think multifactorially to a greater extent than men do, they should be naturally able to farm better than men do. And indeed, that's my experience, and I'm sure Vanjira can confirm that. When you go to a community and you find the best farm, the people who are the most outstanding farmers, they always have two things in common. One, they're geeks. They love to think and experiment and see what's going on. Two, they're women. They very often are women. Now, that would be fantastic if men were to recognize the fantastic asset that they have in women and made their own the famous Chinese saying, women hold up half the sky. But they don't. And in way too many cases, you have situations where women try to control everything and prevent women from dealing with the consequences or the preparation for climate change and other shocks. They destroy women's resilience. A perfect example for that are the champs du soir, the evening fields in Burkina Faso, which are the fields that women cultivate after they have spent their days cultivating their husband's fields. The husband are responsible for bringing in money, the women are responsible for feeding their families. However, they don't have tenure over their own fields. The husband has that tenure. So if, perchance, they improve the fertility of their soils too much in these evening fields, in these champs du soir, they run the risk that their husband would take over these fields in order to grow commercial crops. And so there is a perverse interest on the part of both genders to maintain, on the part of the women certainly, to maintain the fertility of the soils lower than the fertility of the soils of the men. This degrades landscapes and increases the exposure and the risk to climate change. So very often interventions, whether they are financed by philanthropists or by governments or by nations, will tend to focus on a particular thing. We all suffer from the magic bullet syndrome. Let's just get better genetics in that landscape, or let's just get more fertilizer in, or let's just make sure that they have the right pesticides when the locusts come. These of dollars, and as we all know, African agricultural productivity has not significantly budged from its extremely low level. We now have to recognize that the wisdom of women is on average a little bit higher than the wisdom of men, that the ability of women to manage lands is on average a little bit higher than the ability of men to manage land, and that the traditional knowledge that has been damaged by colonialism and modernity usually had some pretty clever answers to finding out how to make sustainable livelihoods in the particular context of a particular landscape. And if altogether, those of us who work for international institutions, for research institutions, and for philanthropies can begin to make this inside our own, then I am very, very optimistic that we can fundamentally, durably, and sustainably transform not only the fate of Africa's women, but also the fate of Africa's agriculture.
Thank you very much, Patrick. I like what you said about us having a little more wisdom. We certainly are multi-dimensional, and I remain optimistic like you. But the sad truth is we do have existing traditional mindsets about women and mindsets that we need to change. I'd like to turn to Wanjira for a second. And I guess my question would then be just that. What can we do to change these traditional mindsets, Wanjira, so that we can have women strategically positioned, so that they can be represented, as Patrick rightly said, because as they contribute to the economic development of the continent. I mean, Patrick just gave a good example in the agricultural context, especially when we look at this with regards to safeguarding this resilience that they have, because women are working in spite of, and we are faced with an economic crisis with the COVID pandemic. So how do we navigate this new norm and change these existing traditional mindsets?
Thanks, Anita. And Patrick and English have said it really well. I mean, the truth of the matter is, we know that women are the backbone of the most important systems, the food system, the water system. And in fact, it is true that small-scale farmers in most non-industrialized countries produce more than 80% of the food that's consumed. And to your point, Patrick, you're right. You know, even with more money, with more cash crops, you can eat neither money nor cash crops. And so they need to ensure that the food systems are robust and that ensure particularly that food security at the family level, which is squarely in the hands of women. And for years, you're absolutely right. Traditional systems have continued to undermine the role of women, but women have continued to hold communities together to ensure that things actually happen. My experience from the Greenbelt movement is particularly salient here, because I remember this movement was 100% led by women, women who are restoring landscapes, one seedling at a time, believing that with time, the landscape will be transformed, they will be transformed, the trees will bear fruit, their trees will also bear fodder. And just the integrated nature of the transformation that they experience is such a natural part of how women work the land. But you're right, they do not own the land. They certainly do not have tenure to much of that land, yet they're expected to produce it. And I think part of changing these systems is as ensuring that we invest in these women. We invest our philanthropic dollars and shillings in these women so that they can continue to do what they do and do more of it. Most of the time, we find that they don't have access to capital to expand. They don't have access to much of anything to do what they do better. Yet they do it better than anybody else. They have a lot of traditional wisdom. They have a lot of access to knowledge about seeds and propagation. And in many cases, they are in the movement that I've worked with, the Greenbelt movement, they produce some of the most viable seedlings and know how to select seed. But all of that has got to be valued by the systems that exist. We've got to invest in ensuring that women and girls get into the food system supply chains and ensure that they begin to benefit from that knowledge that they have. I think part of building Africa back better from this crisis is ensuring that they, and especially young women, are involved and engaged and incentivized, because some of these systems are deliberately cryptic. They're deliberately made so that women find it impossible to engage, that we continue to de-risk the situation for them, and we deliberately do so. And I think that's a serious role that philanthropy can play, because what I learned is that when with women, and certainly with women at the grassroots, they're the most honest and they're the most hardworking you'll meet, but they are certainly the most disadvantaged economically. It is not a surprise that we have the food producing sector, small scale farmers, are among the most hungry on the continent. That's unacceptable. And that just means that women themselves have got to manage their diets and manage the rationing. We saw this just recently. Patrick, you mentioned the flooding. East Africa has been going through some of the worst flooding in 100 years. 1.5 million people have been displaced in East Africa alone, more than we've seen in so many years. A lot of this has fallen on the backs of women who have to figure out what to do when their families have lost everything. Food security is at risk, and families begin to ration and reduce the calorific value of their food. So this is a really important point.
Well, thank you for that, Wanjira. I mean, it's clear listening to all three of you that the role of women, especially with regards to the food security space, is critical. We are finding out more and more, as with many other, sadly, strata. This is another area where women have been subjugated. They do not have the access, for instance, as you rightly said, to the capital, but yet they do this better. So Patrick, what do you think about that? What do you make of that? So what steps are necessary so that women are given the same resources and opportunities as men, specifically in this food security space, like in farming and agriculture?
Well, Wanjira made a very good point. She made a call for us to invest more in women. But women don't live in isolation. They are not some kind of strange species that live in their own little bubble and you can give them money and everything will be happy ever after. Women live together with male partners, with their husbands, with their sons, with their fathers, and in communities where about half the population are men. So the most important thing that we've found very often is to get the men of those communities to understand the important role that women can play and the necessity for them to give more freedom to their womenfolk to ask. And there are various ways you can do that. We find that gamification is something that works really well. So you sit down and you do what if kind of games under the village tree to get people to begin to understand what's going on. You have role-playing games where men take the place of women, women take the place of men, and they act out how each other sees each other's role. And both of these kinds of approaches bring a very rapid improvement in the mutual respect between the genders. And it's on the basis of that mutual respect that better decisions about how to allocate financial resources will come, for example. And you can always, it's a little bit like a flu vaccination, you know, you get vaccinated once and then it goes away, need to get vaccinated against next year. And we outsiders, and by outsiders I mean, I don't just mean donors coming from Europe, but of course, I mean people like you, Wanjira, when you go into a community that is not one of your own. We can reinforce that message by demonstratively dealing with the woman as much as or more than with the men. We can, if we know that these communities have had such a role-playing game in the past, we can run another iteration of that just to refresh everybody's memory of what it meant. We can have talking circles where we pass the word from a woman to a man to a woman to a man to explore how things have changed since women and men started working better together. The beautiful thing about it is that it works, is that it does work. The really bad thing about it is that it's very difficult to scale. You need to find somebody to go and spend hours or sometimes days in a community and run these things. It's not scalable because it doesn't come in an app. You cannot buy it in a bag like you can a bag of fertilizer. And it's not a one-size-fits-all rule that is set by some external authority like a national government that says you shall do this and you shall not do that. So it's hard. It's a long slog. But what gives me hope in that regard is that we find that as Africa develops and as there's a new breed of highly educated middle-class professionals that are invading business and government and NGOs in so many African countries, that these old gender stereotypes, while still present in the heart of people because it's the tradition, are at least falling away in the way that people are thinking about it. And so that people are increasingly open to try these ways of approaching the situation, which after all in many communities go right to the heart of community practices and traditions. And as we all know from around the world, if progress is a little bit too fast, you can get a kind of reactionary pushback. So you have to be aware of these issues as well. But by and large, I'm quite optimistic. I'm quite optimistic that simply because there is now an evolving consensus, which is reflected by the way all three of us have spoken about it. I haven't heard anything from the other two speakers that I could disagree with. So there is this evolving consensus, and this evolving consensus is becoming socialized amongst a greater and greater number of players, be they in government or in business, and that brings me hope.
I just wanted to add, Anita, that and while I don't disagree with what Patrick has just said, I think what my message would be that we do both. I think we need to invest in women. Women are organizing in very creative ways in circles. And we know from all the data that they invest 80% of what they earn back into the family. I think that as men see women organizing themselves, and at the Greenbelt movement, it was purely women organizing into groups and doing the slogging and the hard work of planting trees and getting this income. We've got to make sure that women begin to access resources directly. It will take a while, like Patrick said, to get the culture shifting where they start to believe, but we must do that. Because I remember, Patrick, many times my mother used to remind me that every poor woman is probably married to a poor man, and we need to make sure that the unit works together. But it is extremely important that women access resources. They are organized, and as long as they are, we encourage that organization.
Well, thank you very much for that addition, Wanjira. And as Patrick rightly said, this is a consensus, clearly an evolving consensus, and we all agree with. And as Wanjira said, investing in women is certainly critical. And that brings me to that call to action that Patrick mentioned. English, what's the role of philanthropy in all of this? What's that deliberate role? You know, we all talk about philanthropy, and of course, we're all here. And to a degree, we're all, you know, if you will, we've been exposed to different aspects of philanthropy, whether behind the scenes working in our different organizations, or even actively participating in the front lines. So where do you see philanthropy within this context, this issues that we're discussing here this afternoon?
Absolutely. And I just want to echo my agreement with Patrick and Wanjara. And it's, you know, philanthropy comes in many, many different forms, right? There's generosity of resources, there's generosity of spirit, and we need to embrace all of that. And I think that when we're really talking about investment and we're really talking about resources, there's work to be done from the side of the philanthropist being intentional about this investment. And, you know, there's a kind of a normed way of doing philanthropy and investing in something that's right there, and it's easy to put the money into, and that's where the money goes. And I think when it comes to, you know, women and women-led movements and women-led projects, and we have to do the work of finding those and listening, really listening, because, you know, these women know what they need. We don't need to superimpose success metrics that in our minds make something valuable or make something impactful, because they know what's going to be impactful for their community and for their work and help build resilience. And I think that it really comes down to, on the philanthropist side, going that extra mile to find and source and really look and be intentional about saying, okay, you know what, is this organization or entity or project led by a man, or is it led by a woman? You know, what is the makeup of what they're doing? Who are the direct impacts? You know, who are the direct people that this is benefiting? And really thinking about that and being intentional about that, and not just stopping kind of at the surface of what an organization, you know, says. And I think that it's continuously, you know, going to be more and more important to find different avenues and different ways of you know, stewarding resources to these women and to these, you know, grassroots, community driven and women led movements. And I think that, you know, what really gives me so much hope in this and in this conversation is that these, you know, women have, you know, they've been healing the world for a long time in spite of the lack of, you know, investment, in spite of, you know, the injustice. And you know, I think that it's just, I'm optimistic in imagining what women can do with the wind at their back. And so I think that the more we can make that the reality, the better off we're going to be, and the more resilient we're going to be towards, you know, these disasters, towards climate change, towards injustice. And I think that that's the goal.
That's well said. Thank you, English. And as I listen to all of you, and of course the focus is women, and unapologetically so, because they are the more vulnerable of both gender. But we shouldn't lose sight of the younger population, you know, the young girls and boys, and the fact that in many countries across the African continent, the youth represent the largest demography. I mean, Nigeria, for instance, I mean, 64% we say are under the age of 24. I believe Nigeria and Kenya, they say about 61% are either children or youth under the age of 24 as well. So like other continents, we have the post-COVID recovery period or phase. And certainly this is undoubtedly very high on the priority list of many decision makers and policymakers across the continent, along with the challenges that we've just highlighted with regard to the climate change. But you mentioned bouncing back and building back, and that was an interesting phrase you used. And I wonder, how does that play in with regards to considerations that Africa should be giving to this agenda of bouncing back, especially when we recognize the fact that, as I said, a large demography are young men and young women. Wanjira, what do you have with that, with regards to your thoughts? What do you think about this?
Well, you're absolutely right, Kit, because the truth of the matter is, we've heard this already from Patrick and English, that we have, first of all, extremely sluggish agricultural productivity in Africa. We have very slow, yet it is a critical piece of the African economy. We've got to get agriculture working better. And part of the recovery, I think one of the things that we've got to really believe is that this is a once in a lifetime reset. We have economic recovery being discussed across the globe. And for Africa, it's got to be anchored in a very inclusive recovery, a recovery that acknowledges our very young population, a very rapidly urbanizing continent, and certainly a continent with very sluggish agricultural productivity and also very fast degrading natural resources. And those are the two systems, in my mind, that have cushioned us for years and that we must build resilience around: our food systems, our water systems, and water in terms of the systems of use, but also the sources of water for us. So I think part of thinking about this is acknowledging that with a median age of 19 years old on the African continent, we cannot talk about building back, bouncing back better if we don't build in this demographic squarely into how we build back and how we deliver hope an economic opportunity to these young people. If we don't do that, we are definitely not going to build back, certainly not better, because we're going to see the sort of unrest we are seeing in so many of our countries. This is because we must ensure that jobs and investment in basic services are delivered to them. And this is an opportunity for us to do that. And I just want to mention the two systems that I'm talking about here, the systems that produce our food and the systems that manage and protect our water. I think those are two very easy ways for us to build in hope and economic opportunity. I'm inspired constantly by the Americans who had at the turn of after the Great Depression in the 1930s, the Civilian Conservation Corps. This was about rescuing a lost generation, a generation of young people who would otherwise, who knows what would have happened. But through our landscape restoration movement, they restored and created some of the most beautiful national parks in the United States today, and apparently also gave us what is the skiing culture by creating some of those slopes. It has been done before, it can be done again. Movements like AFR 100 that is led by the African Union, NEPAD, ought to be at the center of how African philanthropy invests in protecting and managing our water and water systems and ensuring that young people are part of that. I was on a webinar just last week and 2 weeks ago. I moderated young people who are in the restoration business, and I asked them, why aren't we seeing more of this? Why aren't we doing more of this? They said, look, it is a very lucrative business to be in the business as an entrepreneur in landscape restoration, but nobody believes in us. Nobody will invest in us. In fact, they asked me, why doesn't African philanthropy invest in us? Why do we have to go outside to do our fundraising? This is at the heart of how Africa bounces back better. If we do not invest in this population, this demographic, we will not bounce back, certainly not better.
Very well said. Speaking of this particular issue of our young demographic and the impact that this should have, Patrick, do you have any comments to add to what Wanjira has just?
Yeah, I think Vanjira has put her finger on something that is extraordinarily important, and it goes way beyond Africa. You find young people interested in restoration in Europe, in North America, in Latin America, in Asia, and they have exactly the same story to tell. People don't believe in us. That's because the oldies, people from my generation, fail to understand the sheer degree of absolute urgency we're in at the moment. I don't know if you can see this chart that I just put up there. This is a chart that was published in November in the Financial Times, and it's a logarithmic chart. So every change in color means that there's 10 times more carbon dioxide emissions. And we tend to think of this as being a problem of the rich countries, which are the countries on the left of this chart, but it is a problem that's affecting the entire world. Carbon dioxide emissions, greenhouse gas emissions are rising rapidly everywhere because of all the comforts and the benefits that fossil fuels give us. And they're rising in Africa too. And the problem with that is that this has disastrous effects on the management of landscapes. If the climate changes too quickly, not only do you get repeated droughts and do you get repeated storms, but you may have a change in average temperatures that make it impossible for trees that are in your landscape to continue reproducing, for example. So it encourages desertification, it encourages land degradation, which in turn affects your water situation. And Vanjira, you know this well from the problems affecting the water towers in Kenya. And it is something that needs to be grasped with extreme urgency. But my generation fails to see that by and large. I mean, yes, there are some exceptions, and I like to count myself amongst them. But by and large, we all lived in a world that seemed to us to be stable and where traditional industrialized agriculture and financialized societies seemed to deliver a degree of comfort unheard of in all of history to everybody who wanted to play the capitalist game. This is now beginning to become increasingly difficult, just as Africa has this extraordinary pool of young people who are entering the labor force, who realize that their elders have messed up in some way and who want to begin to fix it. And the question that I have for us all is, how can we encourage that? How can we help these young people put their energies behind restoration rather than behind some of the more destructive activities that youth is sometimes prone to. And that, to me, is the fundamental question for both philanthropy and for us as land restorers. And as soon as I figured out how to get rid of the screen sharing, I will stop the screen sharing. Sorry about that. Maybe
No,
if
that's
we have.
fine. This is very informative. Thank you very much for that, Patrick. Um, are we okay? We're back. So I was just asking if we had any questions from any of our attendees. This had been such an informative session, especially for me. I mean, my space is the gender-based violence and women's space, but to see and discuss this through the lens of climate change and the impact that it's having, especially as we know that, again, women are sadly subjugated and not represented in this particular issue, is one that I personally have found very informative. At this point in time, I don't believe we have any questions yet from the attendees. So I wonder if I can throw this open to my speakers, if you have any sort of pressing final words that you would like to share with us on this very important topic. Should I start with you, English?
Sure, happy to. Patrick and Wanjari have, I mean, just explained so well the need to invest, in specific systems around food and around water and the people that make those systems work, especially the young people who are passionate about trying to change them and make them work better for everyone. And I think just echoing on some of the points that have already been made, in this moment of time where we have the opportunity to build back, we also have the opportunity to build beyond and say, what wasn't working with the way we thought about education, what wasn't working with the way we thought about training, what wasn't working with the way we thought about investment, and let's do that better, because we have this moment, we have this opportunity in front of us to really say, what is our youth need to really feel equipped to tackle the problems that lie ahead, and often, I heard this term a couple weeks ago, and it was how this idea of the complexity horizon is so intimidating with the vast array of problems. And so often we see this just weight in our youth populations across the world of saying, it feels too much, it feels so much for me to take on. And I think that one thing we can really do better as philanthropists, as people, as mothers like myself, as just citizens of the world, is say, what can I do to make you feel strong and brave and capable to take on the complexity? And I think that we have a real opportunity to invest and really think about, what are those capabilities, what are those skills, what are those resources, to equip the next generation.
Well, thank you so much for that, English. How about you, Andrea? Any takeaways after
Well,
this very illuminating 45 minutes?
well, when you said that, I thought of a piece of writing that was just recently published by Andurati Roy. She wrote about the pandemic being a portal. And I just wanted to share those words because I think in many ways that's what this is about. It says, whatever it is, COVID has made the mighty kneel and brought the world to a halt like nothing else could. Our minds are still racing back and forth, longing for a return to normality, trying to stitch our future and our past, and refusing to acknowledge the rapture. But the rapture actually exists. And in the midst of this terrible despair, it offers us a chance to rethink this doomsday machine that we've created for ourselves. Nothing could be worse than a return to normality. Historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine the world anew. This is no different. It is a portrait. It is a portal. It's a gateway between one world and the next. We can choose to walk through it, dragging our carcasses of prejudice and hatred and avarice, our data banks and dead ideas, and our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us. Or We can walk through lightly, with little luggage, ready to imagine the world anew and ready to fight for it. That's, I think, what we are saying. What are the new ways? And let's be ready to fight for them.
Well, that certainly resonates with me. Thank you so much for sharing that with us today, Wanjira. And I'll turn to Patrick. Do you have any prophetic parting words for us before we call it a day?
I love that passage by Arundhati Roy Vanjira. I read it too. And she wrote that at the beginning of the pandemic, if memory serves. And now we're 6 months later. And what we see everywhere is that people are tired. People are tired of making the effort, tired of losing their jobs, tired of losing their opportunities, tired of not being able to embrace their friends and their family. And that sense of tiredness to me is alarming because it leads to discouragement. And I would remind us all that even with the lack of travel that the pandemic brought and the fact that the world's airlines and the fact that the world's tourism industry is more or less shut down, we still only managed to cut emissions by 10%. We have to cut emissions by 100% within 10 years. And we are not nowhere close to being able to do that. And that's why the weight of managing this situation will again fall on the shoulders of women. Why? As you pointed out, Vanjira, 70% of agricultural workers in Africa are women. Was it 70 or 80% of the food that Africans eat is grown by smallholder, which means mostly by women? And it is women who can make the difference between soils that contribute to the problem by emitting carbon or soils that buy the rest of us a little bit of time by absorbing carbon. Happily, the Lord has arranged things in a good way. If you suck carbon down into your soil, you will also improve the fertility of these soils. You will increase the productivity of these soils. You will be able to have more nutrition for your families. You will also increase the resilience of these soils to the storms and the droughts that will inevitably get worse no matter what we do. So we can do it, but we've got to stop believing in magic bullets. Here in Europe, just last week, the European Parliament massively passed an extremely flawed bill to support business as usual agriculture, putting all its faith into unproven technologies like precision agriculture and GMOs, as opposed to finally listening to what screaming Mother Nature is telling us. We have got to change our relationship to the land. I would also, perhaps to leave you on a slightly more optimistic note, mention the fact that archaeology is recently being subjected to the big data treatment, and this has revealed something extraordinary. We humans have been changing this planet for over 10,000 years. The southwestern Amazon was an artificial sea with artificial islands, a periodic sea that was flooded during the rainy season and dry during the dry season, with wooded artificial islands in the middle of it 5,000 years ago. The highlands of Papua New Guinea maintained a population density as high as the one of today's Holland 5,000 years ago. We know how to do this, and we've known it for a long time. And the one thing that these cultures that managed landscapes successfully over timescales of thousands of years, and by successfully I mean sustainably most of all, the one thing that most of them seem to have in common is that they believed in an earth goddess or in a goddess or in a mother goddess, rather than in some kind of severe father in the sky, which is what the Abrahamic religions ask us to believe. And perhaps the solution lies there. Perhaps the solution lies in us reconnecting to the deepest parts of our religious fibers, where all of us, whether men or women, recognize that life flows from woman, and that if we metaphorically equate earth to the nurturing woman that brought us to life, then perhaps we will treat her with as much respect as we treat our own mothers.
Thank you so much for that, Patrick. That is a lot of food for thought, I must say. I think what's clear to me, listening to all three of you, is the importance, the role of the woman in this particular landscape, in this particular food security space. I think, as we all know, the pandemic, unprecedented, we are still grappling day to day with the impact and the effects of not just from the health, but just even from the environmental point of view. But I think it also, this particular conversation must remind us of the importance of building and safeguarding the resilience of women, in spite of these, their vulnerabilities and the challenges that they're obviously faced with. Because clearly they are effective agents of change in this food security space. And it's important for all of us to recognize this and to continue this very important conversation even after this session with all three of you. It's important for me to remember to add that APF has launched a fundraising campaign, a GoFundMe campaign in support of Farm Grow Africa, which is one of the front lines of driving food production in Kenya. I believe they're an agricultural and technological firm based in Kenya, and they use innovative and appropriate agricultural technology to improve the livelihoods of many women and men in rural communities. So could we all please remember to donate to Farm Grow Africa? And I believe the GoFundMe details are on the homepage of this website. So sadly, we've come to the end of our hour. I mean, as I said, I've had a fascinating and very informative 1 hour spent with English, Patrick, and with Jira. I would like to thank each of you again for taking the time to share with us, not just your expertise, but insightful comments, as well as solutions to the current situation that we're dealing with. Thank you, English. Thank you, Anjera, and thank you very much, Patrick.
Thank you, Anita.
Thank you so much, Anita.
Thank you, Anita, and English and Patrick.
Wishing everybody a good evening, and look forward to seeing you all again on another panel soon.
Maybe live.
So,
there you go. Have a good evening.
bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Well.
Bye bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.